All right, 304. I think it's ready to get started. Hey, welcome everybody. This is the last cluster session of the day, right before we have the a break, in which I'm going to be speaking, and then we're going to have the keynote, and then we'll have the raffle, and then we're done. You know, thanks for sticking with us. This is it, I'm gonna confess, this is my favorite session. I'm the most looking forward to hearing on this topic of student voices. We've got three groups or three folks, three different presentations here. Jessica Frank, who is the A to J project manager at CALI, is going to moderate for some students. Carly Cazer, a 3L at Syracuse. Jenna Forster, a 2L at UC Berkeley. Kevin Frazier, a question mark L. I don't know what year you're in, Kevin, at Berkeley. And Alex, a 2L, all right. And Alexandra Jones, a 3L at Duquesne, who is also working for us under the ATJ Fellows Program this summer. Glad to finally meet you, Alexandra.
Yes, nice to meet you too.
Following that will be Laura Mott and Asima Chaudhary. I hope I didn't butcher that too much.
No, you did good.
Oh, it's good. Both at CUNY Law School, and following that, Dmitriy Ostrovskiy, a student, and Zachery Taylor, at both students at Chicago-Kent College of Law. So let's get started. Jessica, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, John. So I'm just here to interview our 4 law school panelists, and thank you for joining us on their experiences with emergency online education during this pandemic. So some of the questions that I'm going to start off with, I'll just direct to all of you to respond. They're little short ones. And then if we have time, we might go into some more in-depth individual questions. But for the attendees, feel free to add additional questions to the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the chat. And we have Sarah that's monitoring that one and can ask us questions at the end. But just to get started and get a lay of the land for all of you, were most of your classes synchronous or asynchronous once you went into pandemic mode?
Mine were synchronous. I only had one that was asynchronous out of 4 in-person classes.
All of ours were intended to be synchronous. There were some exceptions if you went home to places like the West Coast and suddenly an 8 a.m. class was a little bit unfeasible for you.
Yeah, we
and
were
all of ours
generally
were synchronous. Kevin and I are going to have many of the same experiences to relate, but all of ours were synchronous.
And I have to give a shout out to one individual who attended all of our synchronous classes even though they were in Hawaii. And woke up at 5 a.m. to attend one 8 a.m. property class.
Oh, that's painful in general, an 8 a.m. property class.
Yeah.
So for your in-person classes, these synchronous classes, what technology tools did your professors use, like Zoom, GoToMeeting, Google Hangouts? And if there was one technology platform that really worked for you or one you absolutely hated, tell us about that one too.
We use Zoom for every single thing, whether it was class or like for our clubs, groups, like they just immediately went into Zoom and we didn't even entertain anything else.
We were always almost on Zoom. Syracuse is in a unique position of already doing an interactive JDI program, so they all use Zoom and many of our faculty are trained in it, which is great. But I had one professor who insisted on using Blackboard Collaborate and it was terrible.
What was terrible about it before you go? And like what made it such a bad platform compared to Zoom or something else?
Ooh, sorry, I lagged a little bit there, Jessica. So I can say it again.
So what about the Blackboard Collaborate did you not like? What made it terrible?
I think that it could have been my professor's unfamiliarity with it, but it seemed that it was less easy to use for him than maybe Zoom would have been. I think Zoom is relatively self-explanatory. Often the chat features were more difficult to get to, I found, and people were confused about where they were and what session we were even in, since you have an option to create like one big, we come to this one every day, or individual ones, which you can do for Zoom as well, but those show up as different links rather than having to go through Blackboard into like clicking different rooms. And it was just a little bit more laborious to get through.
And how about Berkeley? What did you guys use?
We used Zoom for pretty much everything. And it wasn't terrible. I thought, Zoom has a lot of features that worked really well. In particular, our professors used a lot of the breakout room function, which was nice because you could talk in small groups as if you were in class. And then the polling question feature, I thought was the most helpful of the features.
And I think just to piggyback on Jenna's statements, the breakout rooms, I think, can be managed well or mismanaged. Mismanagement looks a lot like letting the breakout room go too long, as well as doing it too frequently. So there's definitely a fine line between taking up, 45 minutes of an hour and a half lecture in a breakout room session wasn't helpful. And so I think there's a lot to be learned, as Carly was pointing out, with just getting professors more familiar with these technologies.
So you guys mentioned the breakout rooms. So for that sort of study group or social interaction with your classmates, how else did you do interactions with the law students? So you don't have the sort of hanging out in the hall ahead of time or sitting next to someone or having a study group in the library. Like, how did you manage the non-class part of being a law student?
A lot of group FaceTime, because it seems like everybody I go to school with has an iPhone. So it was easy for us to kind of just in our already existing group chats do it that way. I did notice, though, I didn't do as much group studying as I usually do, just because it was kind of difficult. People were lagging, or we were not understanding what topic we were talking about. We didn't have like a whiteboard that we could use. So we tried it at first, and it just kind of went into everybody doing their own thing.
Yeah, I'll agree that mostly the group study dynamic that I had used so heavily through my first 2 years kind of went by the wayside, but things like Google Hangout and House Party were helpful when you're just looking to connect with your fellow law students socially again.
Yeah, and Berkeley provided a somewhat enhanced Zoom plan, so all of us got used to having Zoom and being able to do it for more than 40 minutes. So at least in my social circles, of which Jenna's fortunately a part of, we just quickly adopted Zoom as our go-to for Hangouts and scheduled some regular meetings. But they certainly weren't very studious. Jenna actually is quite the whiteboard drawer, so we missed having that expertise. And I do think it's something that schools should think quite a bit about, the fact that there isn't that study group dynamic, because it definitely changes the game.
Did it impact how you studied for finals when it came to finals time, that you didn't have that sort of group prep time?
Yeah.
How did studying finals change, basically?
For me, I tried to reach out to just different resources, and that might look like just more YouTube videos, for example, just to find alternative perspectives on what I was studying. But there was also in the back of my mind, to be blunt, the fact that we did move to a credit, no credit system. So the approach to studying was substantially altered by the fact that there wasn't that pressure to kind of go to the nth degree given everything else that was going on.
Yeah, my typical study group session usually involves whiteboarding and going over hypos, and I'm fortunate enough that I was able to buy a whiteboard that I could display in the back of my screen and write on for people, but of course they couldn't also write on it, which was difficult. And going through hypos is a little bit more strange, so you kind of do it on your own and then try your best to get together to do it rather than doing it as part of a larger group, which is new and different.
Yeah, I'll echo that. It was definitely a lot of do your work by yourself, and if you can, come together and everybody try and collaborate. We had a little bit of incentive to study because we got letter grades. And we can pick whether we wanted to do pass fail. So I still was very much like, I'm going to treat this like a normal semester as much as I can. I was fortunate where I'm quarantining by myself. I live downtown in Pittsburgh, so I had access to things and people, etc. So I feel like it was a little bit easier for me than someone who moved to Hawaii to go back home. We had a couple of students who had to go back to different countries. We had a girl go to Jamaica. So yeah, I think that there isn't a way online to collaborate in a group session the way that we could if we were in a group study room in the library.
So speaking of your locations and where you ended up doing the majority of this online learning, did you find it difficult to find space where you're living, or internet connectivity, or computer issues, things that faculty should know about and be prepared to address if their students have to do this again in the fall?
Yeah, I'm fortunate. I live by myself in a 1-bedroom, so I have like a desk that I had set up prior to this anyway, where I would study where I was at home. But a lot of my friends, they had to return home with their families. So, it's mom, dad, brother, sister, nieces, nephews, and they had a hard time finding space that just wasn't like in their bed, in their bedroom to work. So I know that has been a difficult thing. And I think that professors should be aware that sometimes, we can't come on video because I have a house full of people and, my niece is running in and out of the room, or someone's arguing and I have to mute. Some like things like that are happening because we are all forced to be in our homes together.
I was very fortunate that my parents have a lot of study space in our house that I could go to, but it does, mean that there are now 4 or 5 people in my house at once, all using the Wi-Fi at the same time, all working from home. And I was particularly fortunate that everyone in my family has been in good health and stayed that way. But I think professors also need to understand, in a literal global pandemic, you might be dealing with students who are sick themselves, who are taking care of sick family members, and who have walked into a situation that is drastically different and probably not as good for studying and being a law student as they would have had inside of a law school.
I would second what both Alexandra and Carly have said. I live in a studio in a building of other grad students and law students, and that aspect of it is great because I can still go on walks with people and have the same sort of conversations that I might have had around the law school. But living in a studio, it's really hard to separate, where am I going to work versus where's my kitchen space versus where do I sleep? And that was one thing I knew even going into my fall semester, was that it was going to be really important for me to do a lot of my work on campus because I'm just not productive at home. And so that's one tool that's been sort of pulled out of my toolkit that I've had to deal with, is how to be productive at home in, less than 300 square feet of space.
Yeah, and I would say all of the IT folks at whatever school you're attending should definitely be attentive to the fact that some of the issues, such as turning in an exam, might be exacerbated. So I had a moment of panic where it took me 7 minutes to get an exam confirmed to be turned in, and I was pressing up against the exam deadline. Fortunately, I did not have a heart attack, but that will probably be a normal for folks who are online come fall, just because these systems are being tested. And I think schools should really be attentive to the digital divide that so many folks have to grapple with, to the extent that students are going to need better devices, better Wi-Fi. That shouldn't be what determines whether you get an H or an HH at a school like Berkeley.
All right, so 2 more last questions before we wrap up. So if in the fall, the majority of your classes stay online, would that be a positive or a negative? So if you are forced to do this again in the fall, full on, is that something that you look forward to, or something you just have to endure?
I think for my larger classes, so I'll be going into my 3L year, so I'll be doing 2 required classes that we all have to take, sales and professional responsibility. I think for those 2, I wouldn't want to be online, because they just seem like things that, like, I like doing my bigger classes in person, but our smaller, like 20 and under, like our electives, I don't mind to do them. I would rather not, but I think that it would be easier to do that because it's easier to feel like you have a connection when you're in that smaller group, as opposed to 80 people in a Zoom call and everyone's just kind of sitting there.
Yeah, I would say I think it will be less than ideal if most of my classes are online in the fall. Same thing as Alexandra. I think the smaller or the bigger classes, I think it's more important for them to be in person. Unfortunately, I think the guidance we're getting is that we're much more likely to have our smaller classes be in person. And that's, if that's the way it has to go, then that's the way it has to go. But one thing that I think schools should be thinking about is what they can do for us in terms of study spaces if we can't have in-person classes. For me, the library is a deal breaker. We have to have a library space, even if it means that, we're only using every other seat at the tables and we're wearing masks and we're sanitizing after we're done. I think students just really need places that they can go other than their homes.
So I'll say maybe something controversial. From my own perspective, I will definitely miss being in person, and I don't think it's a positive. It's just harder to learn, especially your 1L year not being able to commiserate and learn from your other 1Ls is a disservice. From a larger point of view, though, I hope this pushes the legal community to really consider moving to 2 years of law school. I think we're learning that you don't need to have 3 continuous years of in-person instruction. And to the extent we can help folks pick up skills in 2 years, if that just means moving to more online education, then we should really start to think about that.
I'm sort of interested to see how this unfolds, because Syracuse University as a whole has announced their intent to be in person. From the perspective of the fact that we are in a global pandemic, I personally think this is a mistake. But the law school is putting in lots of measures to try to make sure that we are social distancing properly and all of that. For those difficulties, I am not opposed to being online. I understand that there are many difficulties, but I think that most of them can be addressed. And not terribly difficult, and it's not terribly difficult to address them. So I'm not opposed or not, dreading perhaps being online, especially if it means that the legal profession now sees that this is a viable way of not only teaching the law, but participating in it as well.
Thank you. So one last thing then, what is one thing that you would want every law professor to know about attending law school online? And we have, an audience of a couple hundred law faculty and law school staff here. What's like the one takeaway that you wish they want them to know going forward?
I'm going to take a phrase Kevin said, the digital divide. I think that is really, really important for people to understand that not everybody has a brand new computer, super fast internet, or is technologically savvy. So to try and make things as accessible as you can. I know one of my professors hated recording videos, but he did it for us because some people just didn't have the bandwidth to come and watch class when we needed to. So just making things as accessible as you can, I think, is the number one thing I would say.
Yeah, I would say adjust perhaps the way that you teach. One style of learning does not work for all students. We've always known this, but now especially that we're, and to borrow the phrase again, in a digital divide, that's becoming more apparent than ever. So be prepared to be flexible with the way you teach class and expect people to participate.
I would say practice makes perfect. If you're trying out a new Zoom functionality, for example, don't wait until mid-lecture to test it out. I know that this is a new learning experience for us all, but I think students deserve to have lectures run as smoothly as possible. So if you are trying polling or something like that, I don't know, get together with your other faculty members and do a practice lecture or something like that to make sure you have it down pat before you experiment on students.
And I think I would say, don't be afraid to try new and creative solutions, even if they are sort of bumpy at first. We had some issues with some polling questions at the beginning, but I think all the students in that class were glad that the professor worked through those issues and made it work. And, I think that that there are times where professors don't do things because they're just not sure how it's going to look, or it's intimidating to do it. And I think all the students really appreciate, even if things don't go perfectly smoothly, really appreciate having more opportunities to be interactive and more ways to try out different methods of doing that.
Well, thank you all for participating, and we'll turn it back over to you, John.
Thanks. Hey, I guess a really quick question. So you're all of you who are not 3Ls, you're all coming back next fall?
That's the current plan. I did give it a thought, but I think I'll be back.
And would you advise someone who's thinking about going to law school to take a year off or tough it out?
I would tell them to tough it out, probably. I mean, it's going to be difficult, but again, I think this is showing us more than anything that we can do this in a digital space. So it's best to get in on the ground level.
I would say, if to anyone who's thinking about starting law school this fall, if you have a job that you don't hate, that is secure for the next year, then just take another year. Yeah. And really, I think law school is so short and there are so many opportunities that it feels kind of sad to be going through this, and that this is going to mar at least 1/3 of my law school experience.
Yeah,
thinking on, if you're just going to law school to get a JD behind your name, then go for it. if you want to build relationships with your fellow classmates and professors, if you're trying to get a clerkship or anything like that, then wait a year. It's not worth it, especially if schools aren't going to give you a tuition break, which a lot of schools aren't. Then it's not worth your money to go through this.
Mm-hmm.
That was on my bingo card, tuition break.
It's on a lot of bingo cards, and it's on my bank statement too.
Okay.
And also, didn't hear any of you wear your Zoom School of Law T-shirt. You know, get with the program, folks.
School of Law T-shirt.
All right. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Our next speaker is Laura, and where'd the names go?
Asima.
There you are. You're also Laura on my Zoom, unfortunately. Asima.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. 1 second here. Okay.
There we go.
Hey, folks, can folks see the slides and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Asima, do you want to make sure your mic's on?
Testing mic. Can folks hear me?
Yes, we can, Asima.
Awesome.
Okay, here we go.
Well, thank you for having us here, John. We're super excited. Greeting, folks. My name is Asima Chaudhary.
My name is Laura Mott.
And we are the directors of the Evening Academic Support Program at CUNY School of Law.
Between the both of us, we work with about 150 1L and 2L evening law students. We work very closely with them as they move through their core doctrinal classes.
And most of our part-time students have full-time jobs, and many are parents.
So as you know, in mid-March, many of the law schools across the country had to make an emergency transition to fully remote teaching.
And this impacted the students the most, especially those that are members of vulnerable communities.
So let's listen to a CUNY law student share her experience through this transition.
Hi, my name is Justine Ortiz, and I'm a part-time 2L student. Over the semester, remote learning has been an incredibly difficult transition for several reasons. Primarily switching from traditional classroom and face-to-face instructor training to computer-based training in a virtual classroom has made learning and absorbing the material incredibly difficult. Second, technical difficulties have been a major hindrance in my ability to learn from home. Low bandwidth and my internet connection have affected the way I connect and participate in class. Lastly, improving my time management skills while in the midst of a pandemic has been a pretty difficult task. Just like traditional classroom instruction, online law courses require a lot of time and intensive work. CUNY Law has done an amazing job at doing their best to remedy all of these issues, but learning from home just isn't the same.
So here, Justine has identified 3 ways in which COVID-19 and the abrupt switch impacted her learning. She mentions difficulty with absorbing material, struggles with technology, and the exacerbated time management challenges.
What Justine doesn't mention is the difficulty of dealing with the trauma caused by the pandemic. Here in New York City, at the epicenter of the virus, our students were shuttered in for months as the death toll rose around them, ambulances with screaming sirens flying up and down the streets past their homes as negative news reports rolled in and loved ones fell sick. All the while, they were struggling to care for themselves and their families and complete the semester.
And we will elaborate more on these themes later in the presentation, including how trauma impacts learning. But also in mid-March, CUNY Law adopted an emergency pass or fail grading policy, like many law schools, in the wake of the immediate transition to remote learning and in response to the varied struggles of our students.
It's important to note remote learning, right, encompasses not just live virtual classrooms, but also the integration of asynchronous teaching tools as well. Given that many challenges that students like Justine faced, towards the close of the semester, CUNY decided to seek out feedback.
So as a result, after the 2020 spring semester ended, CUNY Law surveyed its students to solicit feedback regarding student experience with distance learning, and about 40% of all the students responded.
I bet you're curious about the results.
For CUNY law students, there really is no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are best practices for both evening and day students.
So first, we're going to provide a summary and a little bit more context around the pandemic. Then we'll dig deeper into the data and offer some recommendations by category.
Overall, our students expressed both positive and negative experiences with remote learning.
Feedback regarding the online learning format varied widely across a big spectrum. While some preferred it, others found it really challenging.
And overriding sentiment was that the students experienced challenges in interacting with one another and fostering a sense of community as strong as the one that was created in the traditional format.
Just like a lot of you folks on this panel have expressed already.
Absolutely.
Students expressed desire for more structure, more consistency, and more accessible content.
And as Laura mentioned, as the students mentioned here, students also expressed a greater desire for uniformity, standardization, using digital tools amongst faculty, such as all professors use Twin.
And depending, of course, on your school's resources, faculty will and budget constraints, your ability to address these things may vary. All right, now to provide a little bit of pandemic context, as we proceed through the discussion, it's important to note, as these challenges are going to be experienced much more acutely and for a longer period of time by students from vulnerable communities. Things like the digital divide that you've all mentioned already, I think is really pertinent here. So before the outbreak of COVID-19, a major challenge that students, especially our evening folks, faced was diminishing energy levels as the day progressed, and ultimately lowered their capacity to pay attention and concentrate once evening classes began.
And after the outbreak of COVID-19, these challenges exploded. Students and professors alike across the country, and especially in New York City, struggled with health insecurity, employment insecurity, financial insecurity, food insecurity, and housing insecurity.
And there was also a need to create time and space for mourning and grieving in the face of traumatic loss of members of family, friends, and community. Specific to education, one challenge is really too mild of a word, became delivering educational value to students who find online learning really difficult and frankly undesirable. Other challenges related to that included addressing the needs of students who may be especially disadvantaged by online learning due to disability or lack of resources. Again, this is especially true for students resource-wise who are members of vulnerable communities disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
And then other challenges also included cultivating a sense of community and creating an environment where students and faculty felt more connected and engaged. This may require in-class interactions, group exercises, questions and answer sessions, and communications in general, which we will talk about in our recommendation section.
In addition to the educational challenges generally, law students specifically had to cope with time constraints, space and technology constraints, resource constraints, and also, of course, the inability at the end of the day to really have that unwinding time that they so needed.
These difficulties were compounded for evening students, who also struggled with a lack of blocks for meaningful deep work, challenges with children or parental caretaking responsibilities. There was also unanticipated job infringements on class and study time, especially for frontline workers who had to stay away from families for an extended period of time. Because of the major reduction in the transit in New York City, many students also dealt with late night delays in commuting to and from work.
All of this led to an increased demand for individual or small group skills, academic skills appointments with us to enable students to continue to process the doctrinal material, those of course who were still able to focus. However, while the need increased, our ability to meet that demand decreased because of we were subject to increasing time constraints.
And another challenge that may have not gained a lot of traction was that many students felt a sense of guilt, whether it was from worrying about school while the world was dealing with the pandemic, or not being able to show up or help their respective community members or loved ones.
Needless to say, all students dealt with drastically increased vectors for uncertainty, interruption, and increased anxiety about their legal education. So we saw all this while we were in the trenches over the semester, and once we got the data from the survey, it affirmed what we already knew.
The data affirmed that there was difference in format preferences between full-time students and part-time students. It's logical to assume that one of the reasons for this difference is that the majority of the part-time students work full-time.
And it's no surprise then that the full-time students were twice as likely to prefer traditional course formats, while part-time students were more likely to prefer some kind of incorporation of online asynchronous material. And all of this is to say clearly, again, there really is no one-size-fits-all solution.
But the data also affirmed that students also appreciated the time saved in commuting from and to campuses, especially students who were parents. This allowed them greater flexibility with time.
One such student is Alex Warden, who's going to tell you how he experienced distance learning.
Hi everybody, my name is Alex Warden. I took Zoom classes and skills learning with Asima this year. Yeah, it was a great experience. I got to stay home. That was probably the biggest plus, biggest positive. I got to stay home, stay with my daughter. It was super feasible. I got to download documents into files easier. I got to look at past recorded documents and videos. It was pretty feasible. I'd recommend it for everybody. I'll definitely do it again. Thank you.
So while students like Alex, who is also a parent and a part-time student, had a positive experience with remote learning, others experienced major setbacks, such as you heard earlier from students like Justine. One of the largest drawback reported was that students had difficulty with concentrating or remaining focused.
Other common issues included a reduced sense of community, as you've all expressed in this panel, lower quality interactions with faculty and other students in general, again, exactly consistent.
And then there were also in-class difficulties identified as well. So for example, a decrease in opportunities to communicate with the professors or with other students, unstructured and unpredictable time spent on fielding questions. Students suffered from screen fatigue. Many felt that there was a lack of access to to resources such as printed materials.
Resources, right? So just as hospitals were scrambling for PPE equipment in short supply, schools across the nation were simultaneously instantly realizing the dire need to increase both their hardware and software capabilities, both for professors and for students alike.
And this highlighted not only the need for more technology for those in need, but more broadly for a deeper understanding of the impact of technological options and tools available.
And that's a hard question.
So knowing the challenges that law students face, right, we next asked, how can we mitigate some of these challenges?
And so for this presentation, we divided up some recommendations into 5 categories: class planning, classroom experience, slides and asynchronous materials, Zoom features, and lastly, student support. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was class planning. And we really recommend sending students guidance as soon as possible on the virtual learning policy that you'll be using in your classroom, sample community agreements, virtual classroom codes of conduct, information about security or safety measures that students may take, technological requirements that they may require for your class, and information about non-digital self-care.
And just to note that at CUNY Law, when we did this, we found that it was very helpful to the students. We also want to note that larger courses involve more challenges than smaller ones. So plan or revise format for content delivery accordingly.
Right, just like you all said, students on the call, the larger classes are much more difficult to manage. Another thing we thought we'd mention here is that it helps when you state the maximum amount of time that students should allot on assignments, especially for ungraded participation assignments.
And then also in terms of deadlines, one of the major pieces in student planning is having solid deadlines. Changing a due date for a major assignment compelled students to reconfigure their plan to tackle work, leading them to forego required reading and or other assignments, and this impacted evening students more heavily.
Moving into the classroom experience, we recommend that you set expectations through a class agenda and communicate to your students how class time is predicted to go. Although a replica of in-class, live in person is not possible, setting expectations and engaging in an open and honest communication about class time will go a long way. Of course, in the rush to accommodate students and their hardships post-COVID, we had to be flexible.
And so we were flexible with attendance, we extended deadlines, we extended appointment hours. We also provided multiple ways for students to satisfy participation requirements.
We recognize that students may be communicating with us as professors with various avenues of communication, so we recommend you stay open to that and consider these options.
And one such option is perhaps using Slack. Also, getting back to in terms of concentration, right? We noticed that to increase concentration, students found regular stretching or breathing breaks to be helpful. In our experience, there should be at least a 5-minute break for every 1 hour of teaching.
If not more than that. Also, when creating slides, right? Begin by road mapping the main concepts covered in the previous class. Also, provide an overview of where you are in the syllabus and outline. Include only the essential information. Try and post your slides before class and make them as colorful and cheerful as possible.
As we try to do here. We also recommend that you consider providing more availability and robust access to content. Some ways to do this might be through pre-recorded audio, video, or slideshows. And the evening students or part-time students, whatever iteration of that you may have at your school, really expressed that they appreciated this quite a bit. We also found that students really like to use breakout rooms. As you guys have expressed on the call, breakout rooms allow larger classes to work in smaller groups and it allows students' voices to be amplified. While the time length for the breakout rooms can change, we recommend that one breakout room happen at least every 1 to 1.5 hours of class time. And then you can also assign roles, including who would report back to the larger group at the end. Remember, Zoom also allows you to jump in and out of break rooms to check on how students are progressing. The utility of the breakout room, I think, while used well, and like one student mentioned earlier, in a limited time, not letting it run for too long, is really can't be overstated. It can also be useful to practice key academic skills such as rule synthesis, mapping out the answers to essay questions, or coaching students through group outlining on different subtopics of doctrine. And so at the end of the class, each student who may want to speak with you regarding an issue or has a question but doesn't want to ask that in front of the larger group, it can be placed in a group, breakout rooms for privacy. So depending on the number of students who may want to speak to you, you may want to have that many breakout rooms available. Yeah. The chat box is another feature on Zoom that's really useful. It allows a student to chat with the host only. Some folks allow it to count as participation. You can monitor when students want you to speed up or slow down and periodically monitor questions and comments. Also, ensure that students have access to additional resources, including academic support, technological help or training, counseling, and activities aimed towards fostering community. To the extent, of course, possible by your resourcing and individual universities. So, you know, it really was and is and will continue to be, in terms of faculty and staff, an all hands on deck effort. Encouraging early and adequate technology check-ins with both faculty and students through individual appointments with IT, and providing to the extent possible audiovisual equipment within the school budget constraints that you're working with. And again, remember, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. These tools are meant to offer you guidance and are definitely not all-inclusive. So keep in mind that there's unique challenges to your student population and school's mission, and so you may want to create plans accordingly. A New York Times article that just came out today refers to some released educational science working papers from Brown, University of Virginia, and Harvard. They investigate how students are experiencing learning loss under pandemic teaching conditions, and it's large. Especially amidst budget cuts, public schools, especially those located in low-income zip codes, are really vulnerable to this, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. And this article did not surprise us at all, right? In fact, it only confirmed what we already knew. And so it makes it even more important to try and put the arms of the whole law school around this problem to support our students.
So thanks for listening. And we hope this was helpful, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Very helpful, extremely helpful. So I have a quick question. All your advice on self-care and on people and for students and rearranging things and being accommodating, I think that's fantastic advice, even if there wasn't a pandemic. But I got to believe that in a pandemic, you got to do a lot more of that, because we got to pull through the distance that the screen gives us. Is that a fair statement?
I think absolutely, yes. Asima, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like given that different students have different set of circumstances, and at CUNY Law, we're very mindful of that. And so because our mission is to provide access to justice, right? In addition to public interest, we want to provide as much tools and resources to our students as possible, which may be including dealing with deadlines in a non-traditional manner.
So not all schools have academic support people to the extent that CUNY does. I mean, Laura, you're somewhat narrowly focused on 1Ls in the evening program, and Asima, I believe you're 2Ls in the evening program.
Yes.
And of course, any student can come talk to you, and I'm sure they do. But I imagine schools without sufficient or larger academic support staffing struggled even more in this sort of thing. I don't know if I am even asking for a comment, but it would seem to me.
I would agree with you, John. Absolutely, 100%. And I think, you know, it speaks to kind of this whole arms around the school concept that becomes even more relevant and really resonant at this time. And I think, you know, individual professors, it may be a good idea to really be a little open up office hours, the flexibility, and ask your students what they need, right? And it's kind of that conversation and that back and forth that sometimes in a traditional law school environment may not happen on a regular basis. I think we're looking at something that may need to be more regularized.
Very good. Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to our last speaker of this this cluster, last couple of speakers, Dmitriy Ostrovskiy, I hope I didn't mangle that, and Zachery Taylor, both students at Chicago-Kent College of Law. The floor is yours.
Hello, and good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, Zach can't make it here today, but I'm here. We recorded a short video clip for you, and then I'll just add a couple things onto that. My understanding is CALI has the clip ready to go, right?
That's Tobias.
Okay.
He's gonna get it loaded up in a second. Yes.
Right.
I hope.
All right. Well, if that falls through, I should be able to.
Oh, there it goes. There it goes. Give it a moment.
This presentation
Nope, not that one, Tobias.
About the trials.
He might not have it queued
Not the
up.
CALI explainer. Is it the?
I don't think it's queued up, John.
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't have a note that Dmitriy wanted to run.
So, I mean, if you don't have it, I can just share screen. I don't know if I have the option here.
Yeah, go for it. Let's see. Don't forget to check the boxes for sharing system sound and.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a second. All right. Can everyone see this?
Yep.
All right.
Boom.
Hello, everyone. This is Dmitriy Ostrovskiy and Zachery Taylor. We have just finished our second year at Chicago-Kent College of Law, and we've been invited to talk about our experience with distance learning for CALIcon 2020. So to start us off, Zach, do you have any thoughts?
My first thought is that having just finished finals, I'm also taking a summer class, and while I didn't have an enjoyable experience whatsoever with e-learning the first time around, I'm looking forward to changing my approach to e-learning and also like seeing whether or not my summer professors will also be changing their approaches to e-learning in light of what they might have learned from their experiences.
Yeah, when I've also had limited experience prior to this, and when I first started distance learning, I was pretty excited. On a typical day, I spent about probably 2 hours or a bit more commuting by public transit, and so I figured now that I'm at home all the time doing all the same things, I would have far more free time for study and for hobbies and for recreation, for everything. It didn't really ultimately work out that way, as I found it far more challenging to focus in synchronized sessions than in live ones. But as far as the different platforms used, I noticed that Zoom is probably the best one for large classes, whereas Google Meet, I think, for groups of 4 or less is far better. And also for work, I use WebEx very extensively, and to be completely honest, it makes me miss Zoom most of the time. Though to be fair, a lot of my work is sensitive, and WebEx seems like a much more secure option. What about you, Zach? As far as like first impressions and also experience with the software platforms?
I hadn't had much experience before this either. I mean, I think I use like Google Hangouts a lot to have like video chats with my family or friends. But I also where I was in a ton of different classes taught by professors who were using all sorts of software. So I had a professor use something called Blue Jeans, which I actually really enjoyed more than Zoom. But it also was very clunky and hard to like learn how to use, I guess, if you're a host. So that's different. I mean, yeah, like I've found Zoom to be just the most convenient, although I'm fully aware of plenty of the security issues with using Zoom, sorry.
Got it. And so as far as the classes themselves, personally, I found synchronized classes to be best. I had a couple of others where the professors simply posted pre-recorded lectures by video and sometimes by audio. And I think those proved especially challenging because as the semester went on and stress mounted, I found it more and more difficult to find the time to actually watch the recordings, especially given that one of the classes ran for over 2 hours per session. And I think my main takeaway from the experience is probably that the more effort the professor puts into their practice, the more engaging it is for the student, which means choosing the best software for their use case and mastering its functions and keeping the audience engaged most of all. What about you, Zach?
Yeah, I agree. For me, that's like the most determinative factor, I think, in my experience overall, like academically. And I would also say that my attention span is extremely short on my computer. I can't stare at a screen for 2.5 hours, and I had class with one other person where the professor talked for 2.5 hours. So not only was it like not really engaging, but also the professor could not keep our attention for more than about 1.5 hours. And even then it was kind of stretched. I really, really hope that my summer courses are shorter in length.
Right. And same actually. But I think that that introduces another important aspect of this whole thing, and that's students. It's that we're not all basically on equal footing here. Not that we were before, but I think I think this experience really highlights it for me. Like where I sit, I've been fortunate enough to have a comfortable and relatively quiet space and no interruptions in utility service with reliable and fast internet. But I understand that's not the case for many other students. Some have to balance their studies with constant childcare, including a few of my friends who very recently have become parents. Others, they don't have the most reliable internet service or the most capable computers. Others yet live with physical or mental disabilities, which make learning difficult or painful. I don't recall, I don't think any of my professors reached out to individual students at the beginning to inquire about accommodations. I think that's understandable, as they were under a great deal of stress themselves, and the radical adjustments they were forced to quickly make were certainly imposing. But I think that for in the future, it would be a good thing for e-learning instructors to implement into their practice.
Yeah, individualized check-ins, I think that's important. I mean, some of us also have, I mean, not necessarily directly, but some of us may have direct or indirect experience with people who are actually infected with COVID-19 and are experiencing symptoms. And since my partner's family all experienced pretty severe COVID-19 symptoms, that was definitely, I mean, not to say that that's the only source of anxiety, but that just sort of makes me remind myself that throughout this entire experience, many of us have had all sorts of stressors that have made focus and motivation and basic like hygiene at some points like incredibly burdensome and tiring and exhausting to deal with in addition to school. Hopefully, if Illinois continues to be sheltering in place, I think our locality is probably somewhat more responsible in comparison to many other localities. Hopefully that won't be an issue like in the summer as much or the fall.
Yep. So that's all I have. Zach, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so. Other than I really hate like emails now.
True. So thank you, CALI, for the opportunity to share our thoughts, and have a good day.
Hi, I'm back. Sorry I kept moving my cursor. I kept forgetting that I'm presenting here. I just had like one quick thing to add on to that. I know that I mentioned in the video itself that that none of my professors reached out after sending that video out. I was thinking about it, just reflecting on the experience of the past semester, and I remembered that I did have one professor who stood out in stark contrast to the rest with respect to what I mentioned. And this professor's classes, I mean, granted, this was a small class. There were, I think, there were five total students in it. And all the classes started with about 20 minutes of just checking in, where everyone took turns talking about how they're feeling, what's going on in their lives. And to me personally, this was immensely helpful, but I can only imagine how much it helped two other students in that class who were here on a foreign exchange program. Under quarantine, they were stuck inside tiny studio apartments, 13 time zones away from home, and thousands of miles. And I think that anecdotally, I know that in the area of graduate and postgraduate mental health studies, where my spouse teaches, that's common practice. All their classes seem to start that way. However, in law school, this is a radical departure from the norm. And I think it shows a great deal of thoughtfulness and caring on that professor's part.
Name the name.
It's Professor Alexandra. That's the professor.
I know Alex well. Excellent.
And the class was the part 2 of the Justice and Tax Practicum. So some professors almost seemed impartial to our various struggles. Not that they actually were. Like, everyone has different ways of dealing with extreme situations, which they also were in. And, no doubt many of them were themselves subjected to various hardships, beyond having to make significant adjustments on short notice to their curriculum and their teaching styles and everything. So what I'm saying here isn't that every professor should do exactly what Professor Ravenel did, because that's simply not practicable. In some of our larger classes, 50 students or more, it obviously would be inappropriate due to the inherent inefficiency. But it does serve as an important illustration of one way professors can make their distance learning spaces a safe and welcoming place, so that students look forward to the class, to a synchronous session, instead of perhaps dreading it in some cases. In the context of law school, this is a creative and novel approach. I think, at least in my experience, it's also compassionate and helpful. I think that's small innovations like that really go far to enable students to learn better. I agree that professor certainly deserves recognition for it. And I think it takes creative thinking to come up with solutions like that. I cannot help you figure out what's best for your use case, because I'm not personally a mental health professional. But what I can do is leave a couple of helpful resources in the chat, and I will do that, and I hope that it helps.
Thank you.
I think that's all I have. If anyone has questions for me, please feel free to ask.
Well, I'm going to turn your shout out into a question for the other students. What things did your professors do that helped make you feel loved, included, engaged, whatever it was?
So I had a professor, Ian Haney Lopez at Berkeley, who did a great job of creating space at the start of each class just for people to present any difficulties they were going through. Obviously, that's a moment of vulnerability for anyone to volunteer too sensitive of information, but just having that moment and giving space for people to kind of relate to one another and touch base was really meaningful. So I think saving time, especially at the start of class, and not making it kind of last minute thing to get through at the end of class, was really meaningful.
Anybody else going to jump in? Otherwise, I'm going to turn this into a question for Laura. Oh,
I'll go. One of my constitutional law professor, her name is Jalila Jefferson Bullock. She actually gave us her phone number and was like, look, if you want to talk, if something is going on, like, you can talk directly to me. And
That's
she
awesome.
was like the only one that did that. And she actually texted back. Like, I texted her one time when I was having a tough day, and she wrote me right back and let me just like vent, because I didn't have that, person, because I'm here by myself. So yeah, that was, if any professors are willing to do that, I think that would be very helpful. Just let your students vent to you while we're going through this really hard time.
So I'm gonna pitch that over to Laura and Asima. Oh my gosh, Asima. Forgive me for murdering your name.
No, John, you're fine. Don't worry.
What are things faculty can do, and I know that puts them out, or actually, let me flip that around. What about faculty? They experienced trauma as well, although hopefully they were in a better situation in some ways.
So I would, I guess, start by really lifting up the points that you all are making on this panel, which is the importance of self-care and connection in a time of real anxiety and isolation experienced by both students and professors. And I think, just being on sort of like the teaching end of things, we as instructors, kind of when we come together, we're like, oh my gosh, having class actually felt good because we're connecting with the students. And so it's that social sort of bonding is, I think when that happens, it's a good thing. Self-care in terms of what Dmitriy has put in the chat, I think is they're really great resources as well. Asima, do you want to chime in?
So John, if you don't mind restating the question just so I can fully understand.
I was suggesting that you would have advice for faculty on things they can do besides the idea that Dmitriy experienced, or what Dmitriy experienced, which is having a moment of sharing before a class? Are there other things that faculty could do that demonstrate that reaching out that'll help students?
I think like, so yeah, so one of the things that I used to do before our sessions was signing in early to see if anyone was there and allowing them to, what we would say, like share happy thoughts or we would go online and pull heartwarming things that folks were doing in times of COVID that made students smile. Another thing that we would constantly do, and I know Laura did this too, is like we would constantly iterate to the students that we are here, right? Reach out to us if you need help. And a lot of students did. And I'll give you an example. As you heard from one of the students who was providing her perspective on her experience with COVID-19 and distance learning, she would set out a time once a week to just speak with me about what was going on, right? So whether it was how she's handling taking care of patients, dealing with work, managing school, and it was a great check-in for me to kind of see how she, just like other students, are experiencing this. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, okay, you go, Steve. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It was kind of a half thought there, which was just, I'm remembering, that as the semester came to a close, the group of folks that I worked with this year were kind of in the process of self-establishing like a buddy system for each other, and kind of making real deliberate attempts at sort of like wellness accountability within the cohort of students that they were in. And so that's not as much a faculty directed thing as it is a student directed thing, but I just thought I'd drop that in there. But Asima, keep going, sorry.
No, it's okay. I know we also presented opportunities for folks who were interested in meditation. And so we would hold live streamings to allow folks that would be interested in meditation to join virtual meditation. We also had once a week, I forget the title, or was it the movies once a week on Fridays, where we allowed, which one was it? I forgot the title of it. Do you remember?
I forget what the name of the programming is, what we termed it, but it's every Friday a professor or two or some alums or students will kind of be on an informal panel where we'll do a film screening, and so the community can come together on Zoom, watch the movie, and then have a discussion. So it's kind of fun, It's we do it on Instagram, I think, and online, and that's been good too. I think the overriding theme is connection, and doing whatever you feel as though you are comfortable and capable of as an instructor, to foster connection between yourself and the students and to let them know that you care about them. That can take the form of inviting weekly check-ins, like Asima mentions, if that's something that you're open to. That can take the form of setting aside class time. That can take to have small group discussions or big group discussions about everything that's going on, sharing positive positive stories or news articles. It can also take the form of just being really open with your students about how you're feeling and about what you're experiencing, because the connection and the anxiety I think that we all feel in this time, compounded by so many things, can be assuaged by knowing that other folks are going through the same thing, and that professors are human too, right? So we say that a lot.
That's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, all of you, all students, and Laura and Asima, for that. That was a fantastic session. Let's wrap it up and take a break. And we're running a little late as usual, so we'll start probably a little late in the next break. It's just me talking. I got nothing really useful to say. It's just talking about the future of CALI and stuff. So probably about 4:15 over there. All right. Thanks so much, folks.
Thank you.